Silas Bramwell stood on the steps of the Larkspur Valley courthouse with his father's will still folded in his fist and told the lawyer plainly that the old man had gone and outsmarted him from beyond the grave. The will was simple enough to break a man's jaw with its simplicity. Silas would inherit Bramwell Ranch outright, every acre and every head of cattle his father had spent 30 years building. He would only inherit it, however, if he married within 60 days of the reading. If he did not, the ranch passed whole to his cousin Wendell, a man who had never mended a fence in his life and would have the whole spread sold to a mining syndicate before the ink dried on the deed. The lawyer, reading the will, had paused twice to let the room absorb the terms, watching Silas's face for a reaction the way a man watches weather for a storm he suspects is already overhead. Silas gave him nothing but a flat stare. Inside, though, he was already running the numbers on how a man was supposed to find, court, and marry a wife inside 2 months, while also running 400 acres alone, and none of the sums he tried came out kindly. Wendell had been standing at the back of the courthouse that morning, and he had not bothered to hide his smile. 60 days, he said, was not much time to find a woman willing to marry a man as ill-tempered as Silas Bramwell. He offered, with mock generosity, to save everyone the trouble and buy the ranch now at a fair price. Silas told him exactly what he could do with his fair price, in language the courthouse clerk later repeated to 3 separate neighbors before noon, and walked out into the street with a clock now running in his chest that he could not silence no matter how hard he tried to think of anything else. 2 states east, in a schoolroom in Missouri, Araminta Voss was being dismissed from her teaching post for the 2nd time that year. This time the board made certain it would be her last. She had been let go for telling a visiting inspector, in front of the entire 8th grade, that his arithmetic method was 30 years out of date and his manners were worse. The inspector had gone red in the face and demanded an apology on the spot, tapping his cane against the floorboards as though the sound alone might shame her into it. Araminta did not give him one. She told him instead that a man who could not accept correction from a school teacher had no business correcting anyone else's arithmetic, and the room of 13-year-olds had laughed before they thought better of it. She had never once apologized for saying a true thing plainly, not that day, and not in the 11 years of teaching that came before it. She was beginning to understand that this particular habit had cost her every position a respectable woman in Missouri was supposed to want. Her Aunt Beulah told her over supper that a sharp tongue was a fine thing in a schoolroom and a ruinous thing in a parlor, and that no decent man in the county would risk marrying a woman who corrected him in front of company. Araminta did not argue the point, mostly because she suspected her aunt was right. That suspicion sat in her chest like a stone she had carried so long she had stopped noticing its weight, though she told herself she did not want a husband who needed managing with silence anyway. I have heard this part of the story told a dozen ways across Colorado, and it never once starts with romance. It starts with 2 people who had each been told the truest thing about themselves was also the thing that would keep them alone. Araminta's father had taught school himself years before he died, and he had always told her that a mind trained to argue well was worth more than a face trained to smile agreeably, though he had confessed near the end that he worried the world would not agree with him. She kept his old dictionary on the shelf above her bed and consulted it the way other women consulted scripture, less for the definitions than for the habit of precision it had taught her. The sense that words mattered enough to choose correctly and defend once chosen. It was that same precision, more than any real cruelty, that had gotten her dismissed twice over, though no school board in Missouri had ever cared to make the distinction. It was Beulah, oddly enough, who first mentioned the advertisement. A cousin out west had clipped it from a Colorado newspaper and sent it along as a joke, a rancher near Larkspur Valley seeking a wife through correspondence. No mention of temperament required anywhere in the notice. Araminta read it twice at the kitchen table, while her aunt pretended not to watch her read it. She wrote her reply that same night, not because she believed in romance carried by mail, but because a schoolroom that no longer wanted her and a parlor that never had left very little reason to stay in Missouri at all. Silas answered a dozen letters that first week after the reading, and he threw out 11 of them before finishing the first paragraph. Most of the women writing to him described themselves in the soft, agreeable language his mother used to use when she wanted something from his father. Words like biddable and even-tempered filled page after page, and every one of those words made Silas more certain the woman behind them was hiding something worse underneath. He had grown up watching his father manage a difficult ranch with a difficult temper, and he had no patience left for anyone who pretended not to have a temper of her own. Araminta's letter was the 12th, and it did not describe her as agreeable at all. She wrote that she had been dismissed from 2 teaching positions for speaking her mind. She wrote that she did not sew particularly well, and that any man expecting a quiet wife should look elsewhere before he wasted a stamp writing back. Silas read it once, laughed out loud for the first time since the will was read, and wrote back that same evening offering to send for her within the week, since a clock was running and he had no patience left to waste on soft answers either. Bramwell Ranch was not, in truth, a simple inheritance to protect. It carried debts from a dry summer 2 years back, a herd smaller than it had been in his father's prime, and a banknote that would need renewing within the year regardless of who held the deed. Silas had spent the week since the reading doing arithmetic nearly as often as he read letters, and he had concluded that a wife who could keep honest books mattered to him nearly as much as one who could keep an honest tongue, and that the 2 qualities, in his experience, tended to travel together in the same difficult sort of woman. He did not mention the 60 days in that first letter. It was Hollis Greer, his ranch foreman since before his father's health began to fail, who told Silas plainly over supper that a woman deserved to know the whole shape of the bargain before she boarded a train for it, deadline included. Silas wrote a second letter the next morning laying out the will exactly as it stood. He named the 60 days, the cousin waiting to inherit if the marriage did not take, and told Araminta she was welcome to change her mind now that she knew the truth of what she was walking into. Araminta wrote back within the week that she had never once in her life backed away from a deadline. A man honest enough to admit he needed a wife by a certain date, she wrote, was a good deal more trustworthy than one who pretended he simply wanted her company. She added near the bottom of the page that she expected to be consulted on ranch matters, same as any partner would be, and that she did not intend to sit quietly in a parlor while a man twice her size made every decision alone. Silas wrote back a single line agreeing to the terms, which Araminta decided told her more about his character than a longer letter ever could have. She boarded the train 3 days later with a single trunk and her father's old dictionary. Beulah wept at the station, insisting even then that Araminta would come to regret the whole arrangement within the month. Araminta kissed her aunt's cheek, told her she had regretted plenty of things in her life, but honesty had never once been one of them, and climbed aboard with a growing suspicion that whatever waited for her in Colorado, it would not be dull. A woman across the aisle spent the second day of the journey asking pointed questions about why a lady would travel so far to marry a stranger, and grew increasingly scandalized with each honest answer Araminta gave her. When the woman finally suggested that such an arrangement sounded more like a business transaction than a marriage, Araminta agreed plainly that it was exactly that, and added that she had never yet seen a marriage, arranged or otherwise, that wasn't a business of one kind or another underneath the flowers. The woman did not speak to her again for the rest of the ride, which suited Araminta fine. The quiet gave her time to turn the arrangement over from every angle a sharp mind could find. She was, by her own honest accounting, being hired to save a man's inheritance, not courted for her own sake. And there was a particular flavor of pride wounded by that fact, even as her arithmetic told her the bargain suited her well enough. She decided, somewhere past the Kansas border, that she would tell him plainly on arrival exactly what he was getting, before he had any illusions left to lose. Silas met her train himself instead of sending a hand, which surprised Hollis more than it surprised Araminta, since she had no prior version of the man to compare against. He was taller than his letters suggested and said less in person than he had on paper. He studied her the whole ride to the ranch with the flat, assessing look of a man pricing a horse before a hard winter. And Araminta decided partway through the silence that she preferred it to false flattery, and told him so plainly. That earned her the first real laugh she heard out of him. The ranch house sat low against the foothills with the larkspur peaks rising blue behind it. Araminta thought it the plainest, sturdiest thing she had seen in months, which she meant as a compliment, though Silas did not immediately take it as one. He set her trunk on the porch and stood there a moment longer than the task required, as though bracing himself for something. Araminta decided the moment called for plain speaking rather than patience. "My tongue is too sharp for a wife," she told him. "I have been dismissed from 2 schools for it, and my own aunt will tell you I have never once held it in a room that needed quiet." Silas looked at her for a long moment, the same assessing look from the wagon, and something in his face shifted before he answered. "Mine's sharper," he said. "Ask any man in this valley who's tried to buy this ranch out from under me. I didn't send for quiet, Miss Voss. I sent for someone who wouldn't flinch when the 60 days got hard, and a soft tongue flinches first every time." It was not romance, not by any definition Araminta had grown up expecting. It landed somewhere romance had never quite managed to reach in her. A plain recognition between 2 people who had each been told their honesty was a flaw worth correcting. She married him 3 days later, in front of a circuit preacher and 4 ranch hands, wearing a traveling dress instead of anything finer. Neither of them pretended the wedding was anything but the first practical step in a 60-day arrangement, though Hollis swore afterward that Silas had shaved twice that morning for a ceremony he claimed not to care about. The preacher, an older man who had married half the valley over 30 years, remarked afterward that he had officiated a great many weddings built on love at first sight and precious few built on plain honesty, and that he suspected the second kind wore better in the long winters. The weeks that followed settled into an argument neither of them seemed to want to win outright. Araminta corrected his account books, which were a disaster of crossed-out figures and guesswork. Silas corrected her fence mending, which was worse, and told her so without an ounce of mercy. Both of them found something close to enjoyment in the correcting itself, a sparring that left neither one wounded, and both of them, if pressed, would have admitted they looked forward to supper more than either cared to say aloud. One evening Araminta caught him smiling at her over the ledger she had finally balanced correctly. When she asked what amused him, he told her that watching her win an argument with a column of numbers was the finest entertainment the ranch had produced in years. She threw a pencil at him for that. He caught it without looking up, which told her more about how closely he'd been watching her than any compliment could have managed. It was a supplier from town, not either of them, who tested the marriage first. A grain merchant named Purdy tried to shortchange the ranch on a delivery of feed, assuming a new bride would not think to count the sacks against the invoice. Araminta counted them twice in front of him, informed him precisely how many sacks were missing and what the shortfall would cost him in future business with every ranch in the valley, and sent him back to town with a bill corrected in her own hand. Silas heard the story from Hollis before Araminta ever mentioned it herself, and he told her at supper that he had married a woman who could apparently run the whole ranch without him, which he said was either the most reassuring or the most humbling thing a man could learn about his own wife in the same week. Wendell Bramwell did not accept his cousin's marriage quietly. He rode out to the ranch in the 3rd week under the excuse of offering a wedding gift. The true purpose of the visit became clear within the hour, as he asked Araminta a string of pointed questions about how she and Silas had met, how long they had corresponded, and whether she found ranch life to her liking, all phrased with the careful softness of a lawyer, building a case rather than a cousin making conversation. Araminta answered every question honestly and without flinching. When Wendell finally asked, with poorly disguised hope, whether she found the marriage difficult, given how little time she and Silas had actually spent as a courting couple, she told him plainly that difficulty was a poor word for it, since she had never once found honesty difficult, only rare. That seemed to disappoint Wendell more than any lie would have, since a lie he could have caught, and a truth he could only resent. He left that afternoon with a thin smile and a promise to visit again soon. Silas watched him ride off the property with the particular stillness of a man deciding exactly how much trouble his cousin intended to cause. The trouble arrived formally 2 weeks later. A county lawyer Wendell had hired sent a letter arguing that a marriage arranged purely to satisfy a will's conditions was no true marriage at all, and that the judge overseeing the estate ought to interview both Silas and Araminta separately before certifying the union at the 60-day mark. The letter cited 2 prior cases from neighboring counties where similar arrangements had been challenged successfully, and Silas noted with some bitterness that Wendell had clearly spent more time and money hunting precedent than he had ever spent on the ranch itself. Silas read the lawyer's letter twice and set it on the table without comment, but Araminta noticed his jaw working the way it did whenever he was choosing not to say the first thing that came to him. That night, for the first time since the wedding, the 2 of them sat on the porch without arguing about anything at all. The silence between them carried a different weight than their usual sparring. Araminta finally said what had been sitting in her since the lawyer's letter arrived, that she understood if the whole arrangement had only ever been about the ranch for him, and that she would answer the judge's questions honestly, regardless of what that honesty cost either of them. Silas turned to look at her then, and for once his face gave away more than his words usually allowed. He told her that he had married plenty of things in his life out of necessity. Cattle he did not want, land he had to fight for. Somewhere in the last month, though, he had stopped thinking of the marriage as one of them, and he would rather lose the whole ranch to Wendell than have her believe otherwise. He told her, too, that he had watched his own father grow bitter managing a ranch and a marriage, both with the same hard silence, and that he had promised himself years ago never to run a household the way his father had, all orders and no honesty. It was the closest either of them had come to saying anything soft, and both of them let it sit there unanswered, because neither one yet trusted the softness enough to build on it out loud. Hollis watched the 2 of them from the barn doorway the next morning. He told the other hands that he had worked for the Bramwell family for 20 years and had never once seen Silas look at a ledger the way he now looked at his own wife. That, Hollis said, was to say like a man who had finally found a set of figures he didn't want to correct. The lawyer's letter itself had been more specific than Silas let on to Araminta at first. It named a formal deposition and a request that the rancher's own hands testify to the ordinary habits of the household, whether the couple shared meals, whether they slept under one roof, whether any affection observed between them appeared genuine or merely performed for an audience. Hollis read the letter over Silas's shoulder and remarked dryly that Wendell's lawyer had clearly never spent an evening listening to the 2 of them argue over crop rotation. No 2 people faking a marriage, he said, would bother getting that specific and that heated about turnips. The judge scheduled his interview for the town's harvest social, a gathering large enough that half of Larkspur Valley would witness whatever conclusion he reached. Araminta suspected that was exactly why Wendell's lawyer had pushed for the date. She dressed plainly that evening, refusing to borrow finery she did not own to impress people who had already decided what kind of woman married a man for his inheritance. Silas told her, with the bluntness she had come to depend on, that she looked like exactly what she was, which in his vocabulary was the highest compliment he knew how to give. The social filled the Grange Hall with lantern light and the smell of roasted corn, and half the valley had turned out under the pretense of harvest celebration, though everyone present understood the real entertainment would come from the judge's questioning. Araminta felt the weight of every eye in the room as the lawyer cleared his throat and opened his notebook with a flourish clearly meant for the crowd rather than the judge. He asked Araminta to describe, in detail, the courtship that had supposedly preceded her marriage. His tone made clear he expected her answers to unravel under scrutiny. Araminta answered plainly at first. The letters, the honesty about the deadline, the wedding in front of 4 ranch hands, and the crowd listened with the particular hunger small towns reserve for other people's business laid bare in public. Silas stood at her side through every question, saying nothing unless directly asked, though his hand found hers partway through and did not let go for the remainder of the evening. When the lawyer pressed her on whether she had ever, even once, told her husband she loved him before signing the marriage certificate, Araminta answered that love built on honesty took longer to name than love built on flattery. but that it lasted considerably longer once named, and several women in the crowd nodded before they caught themselves doing it. It was Wendell himself who made the mistake that turned the evening. Impatient with how well Araminta's answers were landing with the crowd, he pushed past his own lawyer to speak directly, his voice carrying an edge he had not managed to hide even at the courthouse months before. He stepped forward to suggest, loudly enough for the whole gathering to hear, that no woman with any real feeling could have agreed to marry a stranger over a legal deadline, and that Araminta's presence here proved nothing but her own desperation. The crowd went quiet in the particular way a crowd does when it senses a fight has finally arrived worth watching. Araminta turned on him with a stillness that unsettled him more than shouting would have. She told him in front of the whole valley that desperation had never once driven her to anything in her life, that she had walked away from 2 positions rather than swallow a single word she believed true. She told him she had married Silas Bramwell not because a deadline demanded it, but because he was the first man who had ever heard her sharp tongue and answered it with his own instead of asking her to soften it. She loved a man who did not flinch, she said, and she had found exactly one in this valley, and it was not the cousin standing in front of her holding papers instead of courage. The silence that followed lasted only a moment before it broke into something closer to laughter at Wendell's expense. Someone near the back called out that Wendell had ridden 200 miles to lose an argument to his own cousin's wife, and the laughter grew loud enough that Wendell's ears went red, and he retreated toward the door without another word. The judge, who had heard enough honesty in 5 minutes to satisfy considerably more than a legal formality, closed his notebook and told the gathering he had heard sufficient testimony to certify the marriage without further delay. Silas crossed the yard to where Araminta stood. In front of the whole town that had come to watch her fail, he took her hand and told her, quietly enough that only she could hear it, that her tongue had just saved his entire inheritance, and he intended to spend the rest of his life grateful for its sharpness. Hollis, watching from near the punch table, later told anyone who would listen that it was the first time in 20 years he had seen Silas Bramwell hold a woman's hand in public without looking like the act embarrassed him. The 60 days closed 3 weeks later with a letter from the county certifying Bramwell Ranch as Silas's outright, no further conditions attached. Wendell left the valley within the month for a mining town 200 miles east, where Hollis heard he was already trying his hand at cheating someone else out of a claim. Silas read the letter at the kitchen table and slid it across to Araminta without comment. She read it twice before setting it down beside the ledger she had finally gotten into proper order. "I told you once that my tongue was too sharp for a wife," she said, watching him over the rim of her coffee cup. "I want to know if that's still the trouble you thought it was, now that the clock stopped running." Silas considered the question longer than she expected, though she had learned by now that his silences were rarely empty ones. "Mine's sharper," he said finally, "same as I told you on this very porch the day you first arrived here. And I never once meant it as a complaint. I didn't marry you to satisfy a will, Araminta, whatever it might have looked like to the rest of the valley or the road that brought you here. I married you because you were the only person in 2 states who never once asked me to be easier to live with, and I have no plans to go looking for easier now." Araminta thought of the schoolroom in Missouri, of the aunt who had warned her no decent man would want a woman who corrected him in company. She found she no longer carried that warning as a weight at all. It had simply been wrong, in the particular way a fear can be wrong once it meets the one person it was never built to withstand. She wrote to Beulah that week to say so plainly, and her aunt's reply arrived a month later, admitting in a single, grudging line that she had never in her life been happier to be mistaken about her niece's prospects. By the following spring, Araminta had taken over the schooling of the valley's ranch children 2 afternoons a week in a room Silas built onto the side of the house without being asked. She ran that classroom exactly as sharply as she had run the one in Missouri, with considerably better results and no board of trustees fool enough to complain about her methods. When a visiting inspector from Denver once suggested gently that her manner with the students seemed unusually direct for a woman, Araminta thanked him for the observation and asked whether he had come to inspect her teaching or her manners, since she only had time in the afternoon to improve one of them. He left without filing a single complaint. Silas sat in on her lessons some evenings just to watch her argue a stubborn 12-year-old into finally understanding long division. He told Hollis once that it was the finest entertainment the ranch had produced since the last cattle drive, and that he intended to keep attending as often as his chores allowed. Wendell sent one final letter that autumn, addressed to Silas alone, offering a grudging apology for the deposition and admitting he had underestimated exactly what kind of woman his cousin had married. Araminta read it over Silas's shoulder and remarked that it was the closest thing to humility she had ever known Wendell Bramwell to produce, and that she intended to keep the letter framed in the schoolroom as an example of what a properly chastened argument looked like on paper. Silas laughed harder at that than he had in months, and told her she was welcome to frame anything she liked, since she had clearly earned the right to decorate the walls however she saw fit. They never did stop arguing. Not about the ledgers, not about the fences, not about which of them had the sharper tongue in any given week, and neither one of them ever wanted to. It was, Araminta liked to be, the one deadline in her life she had been glad to meet, and the only marriage bargain she had ever made that turned out to be honest all the way through. Silas never did argue that point. He only said, when pressed, that he had gone looking for someone who wouldn't flinch, and found instead someone who made the whole rest of his life worth living without one.